and we are going to have one more presentation now from Sulfikar Amir, who is an Associate Professor of Science, Technology, and Society, and a faculty member in Sociology program at the School of Social Sciences at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. His research interests primarily focus on examining institutional, political, and epistemological dimensions of scientific knowledge and technological systems. He has conducted research on technological nationalism, development and globalization, nuclear politics, risk and disaster design studies, city and infrastructure, and resilience. Sulfikar Amir is the author of The Technological State in Indonesia, the Co-Constitution of High Technology and Authoritarian Politics from 2012. And he's also the editor of The Socio-Technical Constitution of Resilience, a New Perspective on Governing Risk and Disaster from 2018. Sulfikar, great to have you here from Singapore, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Okay, good morning from Singapore. I know it's a very late afternoon or probably good evening in Boulder. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Tim Oakes and team for organizing such a wonderful workshop. And I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to share the work that I've been working for the past few years. And this is also an opportunity for me to return to this project, after being stuck with a pile of projects on COVID-19 since, last year. So let me share my screen. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the technical aspect of Fukushima Daiichi, I apologize because I'm going to repeat what you already know. But for those of you who are not really familiar or with what really happens in Fukushima Daiichi, this may be something quite useful to understand, the root cause of the disaster. So I would like to start my presentations by showing you a picture. This is a picture taken on 25th of February 2009. It was taken in Futaba town. In this picture, I was having a really nice lunch in a very traditional restaurants in Futaba town, accompanied by my colleagues from University of Tokyo. And there's one person on the right bottom here. He is Mr. Atsufumi Yoshizawa. He is actually the one of the managers of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plants. He was welcoming me when I was visiting Fukushima Daiichi back in 2009, which is part of my research on nuclear politics in Southeast Asia. And the reason why I was visiting Fukushima Daiichi is because Japan was planning to export the nuclear technology to Southeast Asian countries. And I would like to see in person how exactly the Japanese nuclear facility is operated by Japanese companies. So, after we had lunch, we went to the facility, and this is me and my colleagues from Todai taking a picture before we enter one of the reactor at Fukushima Daiichi. And TEPCO, I was really lucky because TEPCO allowed me to enter unit number 1 and to show me how the reactor was run and maintained by TEPCO. And it was sort of a surreal experience. And that was my first time visiting a nuclear reactor. And I was deeply impressed by how TEPCO managed the facility. Everything seemed to be, perfectly run, and the sophistications of the safety system was something that I really admire at the time when, visiting the facility. But then, of course, 2 years later, this is what happened. Well, I didn't do anything when I was there. I was looking at the facility, and when I heard the news about the disaster, I was completely shocked. I called my friend Kota Juraku. He was in Berkeley, and he told me that the reactor that we entered was just exploded, and that was unit number 1. And this suddenly switched my focus of research from nuclear politics to nuclear disaster. And because of this personal experience of visiting the Fukushima Daiichi, I was really, struck by the questions about, why it happens, why this nuclear accident happens in such a technologically advanced, nation like Japan. And it is these questions that continues to enact me, and I decided to say that, okay, this is something that I like to explore and try to understand, sort of the whole, structures that led to the catastrophe in Fukushima Daiichi. So this is Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. It is a large-scale, nuclear power station. It has 6 reactor units. All of them are boiling water reactors designed by General Electric in cooperation with Toshiba and Hitachi. It started operating in 1971, and the total capacity is 4.6 gigawatt of electricity. And 100% of the electricity produced by Fukushima Daiichi was sent to Tokyo. So it's basically the major contributors of electricity production for the entire city of Tokyo. So if you go to Shibuya, you go to Shinjuku, all of the glaring neon lights basically electrified from this nuclear power plant. This is sort of a history of effluent reactors that is built and installed in Fukushima Daiichi. So it started from this one. This is unit number 1. Started construction in 67 and operating in 71. The reactor number 2 follows it in 69 and 74. And so you can see that this is basically a series of constructions that happens at Fukushima Daiichi. But what I want you to pay attention is on the right columns here, which shows the contractor. And the first 2 reactors were built by General Electric with local contractor Kajima. But then the whole design was actually done by Ebasco. Ebasco is a subsidiary company of GE based in New York. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was the one who designed the whole constructions of the reactor building. Now, what is interesting to look at is that if you look at this map, it shows 55 nuclear reactors locations in Japan. And basically, there are 4 nuclear power plants that are affected by the tsunami. So this is the center, the epicenter of the earthquake. And there are 4 of them, 4 nuclear power plants within the area. The first one is Onagawa, and then Fukushima Daiichi, Fukushima Daine, and then the last one is Tokai. If you look at here, the closest nuclear power plant to the epicenter is actually Onagawa, right? And there's also Fukushima Daine, and Tokai was quite farther, but then it was affected, but not as serious as the other 3. But the question is, why only Fukushima Daiichi that plunge into a meltdown? So that's the question. Why not Fukushima Daini? Why not Onagawa? So what is the particular things about Fukushima Daiichi that caused the power plants to fail to respond to the uh, to the to the crisis, and eventually leading to the meltdown. So this is something that I'm going to give you a little bit of the technical aspect of the Fukushima Daiichi. So something what one thing that every nuclear operators really afraid of is the situation called station blackout. Station blackout is a condition when the whole station, the whole nuclear power station, has no electricity, because of course the power plant produce electricity, but it needs electricity from outside to operate other systems, including the safety systems. Now, when Fukushima Daiichi was hit by the earthquake, all of the system worked very well. When the reactors, detected the vibrations from the tremor from the earthquake, it suddenly stopped the operations and it started to cool down. And then and the earthquake has caused damage to the power grid in the area, so that nuclear power plants, as Fukushima nuclear power plant, lost electricity for a short while, but then of course the station has diesel emergency diesel backup. Now the problems start to arise when tsunami came to hit the facility. Okay, came to hit facility, and something happens which is caused by the design of the reactor. And this is something that I would like to show you from a clip that I cut from a documentary by PBS.
6 generators, along with the wiring, switches, and breakers connecting them to the plant, are located in the basements of the turbine buildings for units 1 through 4. The floodwaters destroy them all. 2 additional generators behind Unit 4 are high and dry, but their switching gear is in the basement, ruined by the seawater. The generators would be useless.
So basically, that's the problem. It's a very simple mistake that Fukushima Daiichi made, which is the locations of the emergency diesel. So this is the structure of the reactor that is installed at Fukushima. It is designed by General Electric in 1960s, and it was the same reactor that was also built by GE in I think about 100 kilometers from Boston. So there's a few similar reactors built installed in the US, and then it is this same design that was built in Fukushima Daiichi. So this is basically the root cause of the problem. It is the location of this emergency diesel and the electrical switching station in the basement of the turbine building close to the reactor building. And no one really see it coming. And this is what I call as a hidden vulnerability. It's a vulnerability that no one really recognized the potential risk of this structure in causing the failure of the reactor to be safely shut down, and in order to be continue operating during the emergency situation. Because of the failure of diesel generators and the electrical switching stations, Fukushima Daiichi was not able to produce electricity that is necessary to cool down the reactor. And And the problem is that there's still heat inside, after the operations, and the reactor continues to produce this heat because of the failure of the emergency diesel, backup, and eventually led to the explosion. So my questions, the question that I would like to address is why this vulnerability remained hidden for such a long time. And that brings me to the questions about the design of the facility. And we need to look at the history of the construction of Fukushima Daiichi, which involves, four companies. The General Electric, of course, the owner of the reactor design, and also Ebasco, which is the subsidiary company who designed the whole facility, especially reactor number 1 and number 2, and of course Toshiba and Hitachi, the two local.
Only see four people when they.
Okay, so I've interviewed a number of people in order to understand what really happens during the constructions, and I discovered very interesting opinions and comments from a number of people who were directly involved in the constructions of the facility. One example is from Yukiteru Naka. Mr. Yukiteru Naka is a former plant engineer at General Electric. When he was involved in the project, he was actually questioned the design which put the backup emergency diesel generators and DC batteries in the basements of the turbine buildings. And this is something that he could not fathom, because he thought that that area, the location of Fukushima Daiichi, might have some risk of tsunami, but at that time no one seemed to care about that potential risk. So he could not get the answer or even questions and propose the change of the reactor design. There's also another engineer, Mr. Tadaharu Ichiki, who said in an interview with the Japan Times in 2011, saying that basically, when they were designing unit number 3, number 4, and number 5, they were told to do exactly the same way that General Electric did in building unit number 1 and number 2. And they were not even allowed to change, even a bolt. And the answer to that questions is that they believe that at the time the Japanese makers were still sort of not confident to come up with their own design. So all of the engineers, the Japanese engineers, were told to exactly follow the blueprint from General Electric's, and not allowed to make any small change, including, of course, the locations of the emergency diesel. Now, I also interview Professor Akira Omoto, who is a nuclear professor at Tokyo Institute of Technology, and he's a former TEPCO engineer. So he was also involved in the design process of Fukushima Daiichi. And he said that actually companies like Hitachi had a design that is more superior to General Electric design, because they use a 3D based platform in order to allow the locations of the emergency diesel not in the basement, but rather outside of the building. But then, TEPCO rejected that idea and decided to use the 2D base design from GE, which is designed by Ebasco in New York. But Omoto argues that basically that decision was fully up to TEPCO, and it has nothing to do with the government regulation. So the government regulation did not really restrict TEPCO to make modifications. It is fully up to TEPCO to do that if they were aware of the potential risk of the emergency dislocation in the basement. So this is something that I've been trying to answer from my project, and the fact that the vulnerability at Fukushima Daiichi remained hidden for such a long time until it was revealed by a tsunami. Let me just read my note here about the notion of hidden vulnerability. A vulnerability is hidden when an entire socio-technical entity is fully preoccupied by a widely shared conviction that all necessary measures have been fulfilled to recognize potential failures, mistakes, and malfunction that could lead to serious accident. It is hidden because this kind of vulnerability escapes attention of the system's precautionary principles and remain invisibly embedded in safety system procedures and operational practices. It is hidden because regulatory bodies and operating organizations fail to recognize or misrecognize the presence of this vulnerability and its potential to wreak havoc on the standing structure and to paralyze system stability, durability, and robustness. It is hidden because the dominant epistemology of safety culture undermines vulnerability as a benign manageable risk or even decides to ignore altogether its catastrophic potential. That being said, hidden vulnerability is a relative term. Vulnerability may be hidden to some while being visible to others. What constitutes hiddenness lies in the presence or absence of realization of actions by responsible actors to remedy the vulnerability in such an organized fashion. Vulnerability will continue to go hidden should realized action never occur or be deemed unnecessary. So my point here is that yes, some vulnerability remains hidden when the authority, the operators, and the responsible individuals did not take actions, even though they may have seen the potential of this vulnerability to cause damage to the system. And there's a number of facts showing that basically there's a potential of vulnerability in that area. There were two recent findings before 3/11 happens. The first one is the discovery of the X69 Jordan earthquake in Miyagi in the old literature. And the other finding is from tsunami simulations conducted by headquarters of earthquake research promotions that shows in 2008 that there's a potential of tsunami between 9.2 to 15.7 meters to happen in Tohoku area. And even in TEPCO itself, there's a number of engineers who develop simulations to calculate the probability of tsunami hazards in Fukushima Daiichi. And I managed to talk to one of the authors here in Tokyo a few years ago, and he shared me this, this paper. And it is very interesting paper that basically resonate with the study done by the earthquake research promotion, showing that there's a possibility of tsunami higher than the tsunami wall constructed in Fukushima Daiichi. And when I asked a number of people about TEPCO response at the time, they told me that TEPCOs decided to postpone or even to not take action for countermeasures on the grounds that there was no consensus on tsunami wave sources in academic society in Japan. So they claim to have listened to the academic society, and they said that, well, there's no consensus. Some engineers said there's a probability, but other engineers, other scientists said the probability is very small. So they concluded that the occurrence probability was not very high, thus not requiring countermeasures. But there's also another interesting study by Japan Nuclear Energy Safety Organization in 2006, which established a flood study group, which is basically almost exactly what happens in Fukushima Daiichi in 2011. they said that if over 14-meter tsunami occur, there was a risk that AC/DC supply, the emergency diesel, will be severely damaged. But then TEPCO again regarded that this analysis is just a study and the assumptions that it will never happen. In 2009, there's also another risk analysis by TEPCO, which calculated a hypothetical tsunami of 15.7 meters at Fukushima Daiichi, but they concerns more on the seawater pumps being inoperable, not the AC and DC power, not the emergency diesel. So it shows that it doesn't, the TEPCO did have the expertise and knowledge about this potential tsunami, but decided to focus on the other aspect of risk in the facility, not the one that caused the safety system failed to respond to the tsunami. So it is interesting if we look at from another perspective, which is more about the institutional and the organizational structures that contributed to the disaster. And this is the conclusion from the Diet report published in 2011 or 2012. And there's five concluding points, and I would like to highlight the first one, which says that the catastrophic event is a man-made disaster that had great impact on Japanese society. And the man-made disaster here refers to the institutional structure of the Japanese nuclear industry that is considered to have failed to anticipate what has happened at Fukushima Daiichi. And that brings us to the notions of the of the nuclear village, which is a notion widely used by Japanese people that refers to the Japanese nuclear industry, but also other promoting and also supporting elements in the governments, in the media, in universities, and even in local communities and local government. So I met Mr. Ida Tetsunari, who used to be nuclear engineers at TEPCO, and he, after working for 7 years, he decided to resign from nuclear industry and becomes an anti-nuclear advocate. And he came up with the notions of the nuclear village, which he claimed to be his original concept. So he published an article in a Japanese magazine in 1990s, which first coined the term nuclear village. And when I met him, he explained to me, the meaning of nuclear village, which is more fundamental than just notions of the industry. It is more about the sort of a combinations of political power, fascist ideology, and business interests. So he, in this picture, he's telling me, the interplay of these three aspects of nuclear village that reinforce the power of the nuclear village from being questioned by the public. Similar notions from Mr. Koichi Kitazawa, who is the chairman of Independent Investigation Commission of the Fukushima nuclear accident. So this is I quote from his from the conclusion of his report, which highlights the elements of nuclear village that sort of implicated in the construction of vulnerability at Fukushima Daiichi. It includes politicians, it includes mass media, researchers, government officials, nuclear power friendly education, and even regional governments. And based on this sort of characterization of nuclear village, I developed sort of a map with a help from a student from Tokyo who came to Singapore, helping me sort of mapping out the structure of the nuclear village. And we came up with this map. It's very interesting. He showed me how the nuclear village, the whole structure of nuclear village with TEPCO at the center of the structure, and how TEPCO is connected to basically almost all elements in the nuclear village, and how every elements provide support to the structure of this village. And it also shows that this is the structure is basically it's too big to fail because of the sort of strong connections that TEPCO has built over decades with other elements, not only in the nuclear industry but also in the electric power company, in the political parties, in the Ministry of the Education, mass media, and etc. So it's very, very difficult to dismantle, and it shows how powerful TEPCO as a company that dominates the entire sector of the nuclear industry. So just to give sort of a reflections of what I've been trying to say here, basically the notion of vulnerability is a conditions that is generated by the interplay of three aspects that I highlighted here, which include the first, epistemological bias. So we're talking about the role of expertise, not in analyzing but in ignoring certain forms of vulnerability due to the the biases in their epistemology. So I argue that Fukushima nuclear accident was not caused by a lack of expertise, because if you look at what TEPCO did or people in TEPCO did, basically they have the ability to calculate and to anticipate the crisis, the accidents in 2011. But it's just that this expertise, this capacity of expertise was geared toward others, and decided and was driven and then was drawn to ignore the real thing that it eventually caused the accidents to happen. And this is also geared by the institutional ignorance within the structure of the nuclear industry, the nuclear village, which is also somehow strongly coupled with the notion of safety myth, which occupies a lot of actors within the nuclear industry in the convictions that the Japanese nuclear systems was very safe, was very durable, was very robust, and if there's any crisis that occur, the entire system have the ability to respond and to to avoid catastrophic outcomes. So I would like to end my presentation by showing you another picture here. This picture was taken in 2018. So in 2018, I returned to Futaba town, and I was taken by Dr. Hasegawa. You may know him from my documentary film if you watch it. So we went to visit Fukushima Daiichi again, and it was another surreal experience that I had, because when I entered the facility, the Fukushima Daiichi, the ground zero, it didn't look like a disaster site, because everything seemed to be normal. I saw the building, the TEPCO building, that was it's a new building. It's a very nice building that looks like a regular buildings in Tokyo. And when I entered the lobby, I saw Lawson convenience store at the corner of the lobby, and it was so surreal, because I didn't feel like I was in a nuclear disaster site, and everyone seemed to be working normal, and as if their life they live a normal life in that building. So I talked to a number of people at TEPCO about radiations, and they told me how confident, how optimistic they were in mitigating the radiations leakage in the facility. But then, my view about Fukushima Daiichi was completely, changed when we, take a walk to nuclear to the reactors number 1, and I saw the same reactor that I visited in 2009, and it was still there. It was still producing, radiation. And at the moment, I said that no, the radiation will remain, will stay for a very long time, and probably it's not something that TEPCO and probably Japanese governments have decided to completely clean up the area. It's going to be something that will stay for decades, and this is sort of the consequences of what happens 30, 40 years ago. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sulfikar, for those really interesting details on the background and technological and related issues. And so let's go straight to some comments from Darren Byler. I recognize that we're running a little late, so we'll try to save some time for a few questions if we have them. Darren is a postdoctoral research fellow here at the Center for Asian Studies, working on the China-Made project. And he's also an incoming assistant professor of international studies at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, BC. He's the author of the forthcoming ethnography titled Terror Capitalism, Uyghur Dispossession and Masculinity in a Chinese City, and also a narrative-driven book titled In the Camps, China's High-Tech Penal Colony. His current research interests are focused on infrastructure development and global China in the context of Xinjiang as well as Malaysia. So over to you, Darren.
Oh, great. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for including me in this. It's been interesting to think with the papers and the discussions. I'm learning a lot. Dr. Amir's paper was a real pleasure to read. It's not only something that really elucidates the actual experience of being in this space, but it also opens up space for thinking. And one of the ways that he does that is by thinking with the network of the power grid that the TEPCO plant was part of, as the beating heart of Tokyo, which is just such a nice image to think about this nuclear power plant as something that's actually driving the life of Tokyo, because all of the power that's generated by it was going to Tokyo. And so what he's really talking about there is a kind of offshoring of risk, a sort of farming out of the hazards of energy production to a space that's devalued relative to the metropole. And he was showing in his presentation just now that there's actually many of those kinds of spaces all around Tokyo. And that's pointing to a kind of exposure, a differential experience of exposure that people that are devalued in some ways are exposed to, kind of precariousness or vulnerability. But that's not the vulnerability that Dr. Amir is looking at. He's looking at a kind of vulnerability that's focused more on the system itself, on the fragility of a system, and the way that risk assessments are narrowed to legitimize projects that state authorities and capital deem priorities. So there's an interconnection between these two different kinds of vulnerability, but he's looking more at the systemic one. And one important thing that he notes in the paper is that power is embodied in material configurations of technology, and technologies are aligned with political structure. And together, they produce an active propagation of ignorance. And his discussion of ignorance is super fascinating. It's a really provocative claim that really pushes me to ask a lot of different questions. Some of them are just coming out of my own ignorance about how technology and energy production works in Japan. Like one question that came to mind is like, if the nuclear plant was was in Tokyo, where the energy is actually being used, would have there been a different prioritization of raising the seawall, making sure that the generators are waterproofed and all of that. And I'm not sure. That's a kind of open question that maybe Dr. Amir could speak to. The other question that it raised for me was thinking about the way power is embodied in those material configurations of technology. Framing power as embodied in the material makes me think about how exactly power is related to technology and how technologies evolve over time, when they evolve over time, how that changes the relationship to power. I was thinking a little bit recently with the work of Alan Feldman, who's talking about in Northern Ireland in the 1980s, thinking about power there. And what he's arguing is that power is not distributed from a center of power that's held in reserve. Instead, it's actually actualized through a metonym of doing, that it's actualized in the spaces of infrastructure itself, in particular discrete locations. And that has an effect in how power actually gets instantiated, and how it can begin to prevent forms of thinking and action. And so the question that's coming out of this is, how did the technological systems evolve over time? When this plant was built in the 60s and 70s, by 2009, what kind of technologies were in place, and how were those shaping the ways that people were able to ask questions about the security of the space? So it's thinking a little bit more with the technology and the material of the technology itself to understand how power was actually affected, and what kinds of role human actors could play in that technological system. So I'll leave it there. I have many more comments, but I'll just send those to Dr. Amir, and so we can have a bit more time for discussion.
Great, thanks, Darren. Sulfikar, response, thoughts based on Darren's comments?
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Byler, for your very thoughtful response to my paper. And I really appreciate some of your comments you make about the notions of the materialization of power. It is true that nuclear power or nuclear technology is a form of technology that that embodies in the structure of both in the structure of power, both material and symbolic. And this is what really what we see happening in Fukushima, in Japanese nuclear industry. About your questions about the possibility or the hypothetical questions about of what's going to happen if the reactor was located in Tokyo. Yeah, I think this is something that relates to the questions of risk justice. I mean, we're talking about how nuclear power plants create sort of inequality of risk, where the people who enjoy the benefits of nuclear productions are not the one who are exposed to the risk of this nuclear production, but rather the people in Fukushima area, right? But then I think we cannot really make a very straightforward judgments about this risk inequality in the context of Fukushima nuclear accident, because if you look at the history of Fukushima Daiichi, it was actually the reason why it is located in Fukushima because of the request from Fukushima prefecture. So Fukushima, back then in 1970s, Fukushima was one of the poorest prefectures in Japan. And at that time, the director of Japanese nuclear agency was a native of Fukushima. And so he wants to build a nuclear power plant in his own, his home, prefectures. And at the time, people in Fukushima also expected to have nuclear power plants because it gives money, it brings money, basically, and this is part of the sort of part of the way nuclear industry operates in Japan. In order to acquire lands for nuclear power stations, basically they give money to local communities, and then there's a sort of agreements made between the nuclear between the utility company and the local government, in which I think 5% of the revenue will go to the local government. So this is something that also entices many local governments to host nuclear power plants. So I guess the notion of risk here may be a little bit sophisticated, rather than just saying that okay, there's people who are exposed and there are people who benefit from nuclear production.
Great. Let's go to a couple of questions. So let's see, Rio and then Hiroko.
Thank you so much for this. This really sort of like I'm having flashback of like earlier stage of my fieldwork where I was reading obsessively about the history of power plant constructions and all that. And one of the things I know, which I find it interesting, that even though you talk to these engineers, they didn't point it out, is that many of the Japanese documents states that the part of the reason why the backup generator was underground had to do with the fact that during that time in the US, their primary concern being the attack from the air, right, from the Russian attacking in the nuclear power plants. So to prevent that risk, they have to design a power plant in such a way that backup generator being in the underground. And then Japan just buying that particular architecture of the plant, they didn't even consider the tsunami effect. But that just made me think about it. But your talk really made me reflect on the yesterday's Professor Miyazaki's talk about who has responsibilities. Is that the electric companies or also the company who built it, right? In this case, like I'm really thinking about that because in the context of the other countries, like importing. Japan is importing these technologies, right? And then, what are the kind of ways like, that type of like hidden risk might appear that not existing in a particular locale, right? Because I'm kind of pointing out the fact that US model came to Japan, obviously not thinking specifically about the local conditions that then turn it into hidden vulnerabilities in your language. And I'm wondering like how this sort of thing could happen when the Japanese models being, sent to elsewhere.
Actually, Sulfikar, I'm going to suggest in the interest of time that we collect all the questions first, and then you can kind of choose how to respond, and then we'll wrap up with that. So let's hear from Hiroko, and then we'll hear from Hiro.
Yeah, thank you. I think my question really ties in well with what Rio just asked. So first of all, thank you, Sulfikar. This was very informative, and it's just really thought-provoking for me, especially because I find it very difficult to really foreground the technological aspects. So, and in relation to that, I just wanted to go back to the question you asked Hiro yesterday about, Matsumoto Miwao and structural disaster. And I think what your work does is really, name and make visible that structure for us and really see that. And I guess my question is, so what next? So now that we have it visible, then how do we start opening up the village, reorganizing it, or is that even the point, so that expertise can be geared in a different direction? And again, going back to yesterday's talk that Hiro gave, he pointed out, as Jill also said, about the manufacturer's responsibility and foregrounding that might be one way. Suspending damage that Rio discusses brings up this kind of other logic of engagement with the land that evades that kind of recapturing of communities that are constantly made expendable. But I was just wondering from the, the perspective that I really appreciate the SDS perspective that you bring, what kind of, ideas about, what comes after the visualization of the structure. Thank you so much again.
Okay, Hiro.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that presentation and paper. I really appreciate your really rigorous analysis. So my question is kind of related to, Hiroko's and to some extent Ryo's question. So I'm kind of repeating some of that to some extent. But like, so yeah, the question is really so after this analysis, what next, and how would you like turn this sort of analysis, which is kind of little retrospective, right, into more kind of prospective and more anticipatory kind of argument. And also, I think hidden vulnerability is interesting idea, but so that is kind of predicated on certain kind of boundary of a village or a boundary of analysis to some extent. Like, so how about like things that still remain outside the scope of discussion, like the fact that the spent fuels have to be left at the power plants, right? I mean, that's just such a unthinkably dangerous thing, but but we don't have a process, and we don't have a plan for safely storing them. So is that also a kind of hidden vulnerability, or that's kind of more like explicit vulnerability? We can't really think of a solution for.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you so much for the question from Ryo, Hiroko, and Professor Miyazaki. Let me answer. Let me respond to Ryo's questions first. Well, when I was doing this, at the beginning of my project, when I started this research, I was also informed by some people about the difference of risk in nuclear power plants in the US and also in Japan. But it's slightly different from what Rios mentions about the possibility of air attacks from Soviet Union, right? What I heard is that the reason why nuclear power plants in the US had the emergency diesel generators in the basement is because they're dealing with tornado risk. And the emergence in the basement location is the best spot for nuclear power plants to have their very essential instrument of safety system. And I talked to a number of nuclear engineers actually. I talked to someone I think also who used to work for GE, and he was actually involved in the design of the boiling water reactors that was installed in Fukushima Daiichi. And he told me that actually the story was not correct. The reason why they put the emergency diesel in the basement at Fukushima Daiichi is not because they copy completely the blueprint from the US, but because Ebasco, the engineering consulting company, designed the facility based on the contour of the landscape in Futaba, right? And they found an extra space in the basement So basically, this is just a very convenient way of constructing the reactor. They found an extra space in the basement. They just decided to put, the emergency diesel in the basement, which happened to be similar to some of the facility in the U.S. But that's not the reason why they put it in the basement, because it's much easier to design, much easier to construct. That's information I got from Professor Tomo from Tokodai, who was involved in some of the design process. So basically, there's a problem of understanding, the potential risk of such a high risk facility as what we see in Fukushima Daiichi. And this is also response to Hiroko and Prof. Miyagagi's questions about the implications of this notion of vulnerability. I mean, after a while, I feel like maybe the concept of vulnerability maybe has a potential to be abused by those who's actually responsible for the action. They say that, well, it's hidden vulnerability. We didn't know it. No one knows. So you can't really blame us because we didn't see, right? So it can be a vindication for their action. And this is sort of a political liability of the concept. And it can become a dilemma if we look at where the argument or where the concept is going to, in order to us to learn about what really happens in Fukushima Daiichi in 2011. But I guess I want to bring the whole notions of this vulnerability to the core concept of STS, which is to discuss and to unpack the limitation of scientific expertise. And I think that's more productive for me. I mean, of course, some people have to be responsible for what happens in Fukushima Daiichi, for not taking the necessary actions in order to avoid or to prevent such a catastrophe. And there's something that we should learn from Fukushima Daiichi. But the question is, what is the right lesson to learn here? And there's a naive sort of a lesson learning that I found from some of the statement from Japanese nuclear industry, which is also followed by nuclear operators overseas, including in Taiwan. The fact that the accident was caused by the location of the emergency diesel in the basements, was responded by making sure that all emergency diesel now are not located in the basement. So they put it somewhere else, right? Which is a very practical, lesson learned. But I think that's not really the main point here. The main point here is that the failure of scientific expertise in looking at the real vulnerability. And it's not that they don't have the expertise. It's just that, they need to be open-minded. They need to be transparent, and they need to be sort of more inclusive in examining potential risk that is embedded in the system. And that is something that I think has not been taken seriously by the nuclear industry. I mean, they remain sort of very close-minded in terms of understanding the potential risk, and they are very technically driven perspective. They use a technically driven perspective rather than understanding from a broader a point of view in which the structure, the organizations, and the relationship with the public are fundamental for strengthening the safety of the nuclear system. I think this is something that we can take as the lesson for the next for the future, right? And try to build a structure that is more open to public participations, that is more open to more diverse range of epistemology, not only the nuclear scientific or nuclear engineering perspective, but also other aspects, including, of course, the institutional, as well as the geological and also the sociological understanding of the whole industry. So I guess that's my humble proposal for us to learn in terms of understanding, or in terms of preventing hidden vulnerability to have a catastrophic outcome. But I guess, well, vulnerability is there's always a hidden vulnerability everywhere, right? And the fact that our ability to understand risk is very limited, and the fact that risks are very complex, and so it is this discrepancy between the reality of risk and the limitation of our knowledge, our expertise, our institutions to understand this, that creates this hidden vulnerability. So so I guess we just need to be ready and to be more anticipatory, and at the same time to be more inclusive in looking at the potential risk that might be hidden somewhere in the system, whether it is in the nuclear power plants, whether in the Shinkansen system, whether in the airport, or any other system that have high risk nature. Thank you, Tim.
Great, thanks. Do we have time for just one more? Donna posted a question in the chat, and I recognize that maybe if we can just do that in just a quick couple minutes, and then we can wrap this up. Donna, do you want to ask your question, or?
Yeah, just thank you so much. That was such a beautiful paper, and so clear and wonderfully executed. And it really made me think a couple of things about TEPCO, and kind of brings together some of the thoughts we've put out there in the last 2 days. I mean, TEPCO owning the accident, but also TEPCO being this kind of multinational financial behemoth that both before and after Fukushima, TEPCO was a bidder to build a series of nuclear plants along the coast in Brazil, and also to build the third reactor on the site in Brazil. But still not clear what will happen with that project, but I think the French actually won the bid on that. But what I wanted to say about the vulnerable harm concept, which I really enjoyed, and I thought it was really nice. I mean, one of the things you said, you kind of backed away a little bit from it, I think for some interesting reasons. Just as a side story, when Brazilian nuclear engineers went to Japan in the aftermath of 3/11, they came back and they were giving kind of public talks and academic talks and interviews. They came back with the narrative that the accident was a natural made disaster, something that they could hardly imagine in Brazil. Although parenthetically, later an engineer quit his job and wrote a white paper that told everyone that the Brazilian plants are built on a fault and are in a tsunami zone, end parentheses. But he was fired from his position because, as you say, like the lack of transparency and the kind of the nuclear village mentality made it impossible for people who had that counter narrative to really speak out. So I'm just curious about this because my Brazilian nuclear engineer friends came back from Japan saying, well, we don't have exactly the same model. We have GE, but we have like an updated model of, this. So like, and we're not in a tsunami zone, which then later became untrue, at least if you believe the white paper. And then, therefore, and our Japanese hosts reassured us. And here were the two things they said: that it was not a man-made disaster. They did not have the narrative that you so beautifully executed. And they also really emphasized this point, which really bothered me and stayed with me, which is that more people died in the chaos from the tsunami than from all the nuclear radiation that's happened afterwards. And that this is really coming from, again, I share with you the STS perspective of like taking these words of these expert engineers seriously and trying to make sense of where is their narrative coming from, and is it worth having a position on vulnerable harm, or do we need to call it more like arrogance?
Yeah, thank you, Dana. Yes, what you mentioned just now sounds very familiar to me. I mean, this is a sort of a common narrative that the nuclear industry people always use to downplay the risk of the nuclear power and to undermine the ability of the people in questioning the safety and the capacity of nuclear industry, right? It's not only in Brazil, it's also, you can find similar attitude in France, in Indonesia, in Korea. I have met many groups of nuclear proponents, and they always say the same thing, that nuclear is safe. Is safer than flying, is safer than driving a car on the highways.
I mean, I'm so tired of those conversations, but
exactly.
But yeah, but your beautiful execution of this, this hidden vulnerability, if I had that to say, that might have helped, but they had so many other bullet points.
Exactly. I mean, well, nuclear engineers always said that the reactor that was installed and built in Fukushima Daiichi was designed in such a way that it was able to stand an attack from Boeing 747. Right?
Right.
It won't exploit even if it's hit by Boeing 77, but it takes only a small mistake for the reactor to melt down. Right, and that mistake was not in the structures, but lies in the ignorance of risk that comes from the nature. And I think this is the bottom line that I will say, that I guess nuclear industry is quite distinctive in a sense that it has some narrative that emphasize or maybe overemphasize, their ability to build a safe system. But it is this overemphasis that I guess creates a sense of what you said, arrogance, or maybe and ignorance that cause the industry to be complacent. And to be overconfident of the safety of their system. Now, there's a history, there is a reason why Japanese nuclear engineers were so complacent and confident with their system, because for many years, Japanese nuclear industry was relatively safe. While there's some minor accident, the largest one in Kashiwazaki Kariwa in 2007, there was a crack that resulted in radiation leakage, but then they managed to contain it so that the plant continued to operate a few months after that, and they said that they already take countermeasures to make sure that the similar accidents in Kashiwazaki Kariwa will not happen in other places. And that's the reason why they built anti-earthquake building in Fukushima Daiichi, which actually saved a lot of people from the earthquake, right? But then what they didn't see is the risk from other sectors, from other side, and that's because they were overconfident with their risk analysis. And the fact that they already built this, anti-earthquake building, that led them to downplay other potential risk. And despite the fact that people already told them, even the TEPCO engineers already built simulations, but they decided not to pay attention to it. So there's this a whole structural environment that I guess led the engineers to have a focus on certain things and decide to ignore other things. And I think this is an indication of the inability of the expertise in understanding or in comprehending the whole reality of risk in such a very complex system like nuclear power plants. Yeah.
Well, thanks for that. What a great session, and what a great day of papers and conversations. It's been great. And I think people could use a break. I'm going to invite the paper presenters and the discussants to join us for a brief wrap-up session. I know we've gone over time, but I think that's just a testament to the ideas that we've been working with and how complex and interesting they are. But I would like to have just a final wrap-up session for the discussants and the paper presenters, and we'll try to make that brief. Please note that that's a different Zoom link. So we will end this session. For the rest of you, thank you so much for joining us for this workshop, and it's been a really stimulating afternoon, and thank you for